It was a fairly quiet, fairly conformist period. And the parents in that period were living out a kind of idealized life that for many of them they had kind of postponed through some rather tough times. The Depression, obviously World War II. So you came out of World War II and the Depression with a desire to get back to kind of a normal existence. There was a kind of celebration of family, a celebration of an embracing of a suburban life. And so I think those kind of desires, a desire to kind of put the turbulence of the 30s and 40s, early 40s anyway, behind them and get back to kind of a normal existence, really did shape the childhoods of a lot of white middle class kids anyway. So there was this celebration of family. I mean, this was an extraordinary baby boom. And an inordinate number of kids born during a fairly short range of years. Again, as part of it is because adults put off having children because the Depression would not allow them or did not provide them with the financial resources to start a family. Many men were off doing, in World War II, serving in the military. So you have a fairly large number of people all launching families at roughly the same time, and you did produce an enormous demographic explosion. And that fundamentally changed the relationship between generations in a way that was profoundly important in the development of this thing we called the 60s. I mean, normally young people aspire to grow up to be adults because that's where the center of cultural and political attention is. Well, for these kids very early on, it was square on them. They were the center of everything. And I remember, I'm a late baby boomer, a relatively late baby boomer, but I remember with delighted shock looking at Life magazine in something like 62 or 63 and going, and there was a long, serious pictorial essay on the makeout party, the California makeout party. And I went, my God, it's my life. My life is important. And from that moment on, I felt as if I was, or at least people like me, my peers and myself, were the center of political and generational and social and cultural attention in this country. That fundamentally changes relations between the generations and makes a very distinctive experience. This generation was kind of imbued with a sense of potency very early on. We can be different. Life as we've known it in the past can change. I really think they had very few horizons, or rather very few constraints on what they could imagine the horizon to be. There was a kind of sense of invulnerability. These were idyllic times in a certain sense, and they were also an enormous period of prosperity. So that with the kind of cultural spotlight squarely on them and with seemingly unlimited opportunities, they could dare to do things and conceive of themselves and conceive of their life opportunities in ways that other generations simply hadn't been able to. If you were a kid growing up in the late 20s, early 30s, you were forced by circumstances certainly to limit your horizons rather dramatically. I suspect that's true in World War II as well. These kids seemingly had the world laid out before them. And I think that is a set of mixed messages. Yes, they're kind of conformist, be proper, we want you to succeed in rather conventional ways, but you're the center of attention, we want the absolute best for you, dream big, aspire big, reach out. I mean, it was a perfect setting in which the youth culture, in a certain sense, could blossom. Life in the suburbs was organized around the kids again. They were the center of attention, endless round of Little League games and PTA meetings, etc. So it was in the suburbs, in a certain sense, that this message about the importance and the uniqueness and the generational potency associated with these kids, I think, was delivered with real force. So I suspect that's how it was experienced. At some point, but that's much later, they come to view it in rather critical terms as being insular and constraining and confining. But at that point in time, I suspect it was simply experienced as a world in which I'm surrounded by my kind of people and I'm being celebrated and my life is and I'm being told my life is very significant. The split begins to occur, I would say, because other perspectives on this way of life and on the insular world in which these kids have been embedded start to seep in, start to creep into the fabric of their existences. I don't think one can underestimate the importance of the civil rights movement. I'll put it baldly. I don't think there would have been any 60s, whatever that was, without the civil rights movement. I mean, again, when we think of the 60s stereotypically, I think we think of the white middle class experience of the 60s. But it has its roots squarely in the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement probably most forcefully began to let kids and others in society know that all was not so rosy in this idealized American landscape. That there were really things called race. There was things like racism and discrimination and poverty and brutality and oppression that simply didn't accord with the idealized way of life that was supposedly being played out in the suburbs. That's certainly not the only influence, but that's a very powerful one. Again, we think of the 50s as quiescent and peaceful and complacent and conformist, but these kids, or certainly their parents, would click on the tube and would see played out nightly scenes of real violence in their country, which they had been taught was such a wonderful, humane place. I mean, I was talking with an individual who had been active in the civil rights movement, a white volunteer, and that person said, we're depicted as this kind of angry generation. But no one ever seems as if we grew up angry. Well, no one seems to ask, where did the anger come from? Well, a lot of it comes from this gap between this idealized image of America that we were taught to believe in, and then the reality of American life, the not so pleasant realities of American life that didn't accord with that idealism. The idealism that we were raised to believe in, contradicted as it was by these more unseemly events in American society, fueled the anger. I think the economic factor, the factors in the 50s is arguably the key piece of the whole puzzle. This was a period of unprecedented national prosperity. You came out of the war years, and two things really fueled the prosperity. One was the Cold War, ironically. You still had massive defense spending to counter the threat of communist expansion all over the globe. But beyond that, you also had parents producing large numbers of children. And that created an enormous market for all manner of goods and services. So the money kind of flowing through the system all through the late 40s, through the 50s, well into the 60s, allowed for a kind of indulgence and a kind of unlimited horizons and a sense of the possible that all generations don't experience. And that was a profoundly important part of this whole story.